now look into space, to the moon, and to the planets beyond.
On the 25th of May, 1961, President John F. Kennedy of the United States of America committed the resources of his nation and launched Project Apollo, the greatest technological undertaking in the history of mankind.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal, before this decade is out, of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Liftoff on Apollo 11.
This was the race to space, working to beat the Russians. And the enthusiasm was absolutely tremendous.
People were absolutely glued to their televisions. It was a transformative event in human history.
The Eagle has landed.
1/5 of humanity watched Neil Armstrong's footsteps in 1969.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
For one priceless moment in the whole history of man, all the people on this earth are truly one.
But only 2 years later, in 1972, public and political interest in Apollo had dwindled. NASA was forced to cancel their last 3 missions, making Apollo 17 man's final mission to the moon. Astronauts Eugene Cernan, Harrison Schmitt, and Ronald Evans were the 3 brave men chosen to fly NASA's final mission. They have been written up in history books and acknowledged by the space and scientific communities, but have never received the public recognition they truly deserved. Yet Apollo 17's voyage to the moon was the crowning glory of man's lunar exploration.
Apollo 17 broke so many records.
It's got to be one of the most proud moments of my life, I guarantee you.
The crew spent 3 days on the lunar surface. Their moonwalks lasted 8 hours. They covered a greater distance than any other mission.
The scientific legacy of Apollo 17 has been enormous. Had Apollo 17 not happened when it did, I shudder to think really what textbooks would have to say, even now, about the early history of the solar system.
Man, I covered ground like a kangaroo.
Apollo 17 did mark the end of an era. Since then, we haven't travelled into space as far.
Apollo 17 is the hidden jewel of the US lunar space program.
The world knows how the Apollo program began, but very few truly understand how it ended. This is the remarkable story of the determination and courage of a generation. A tribute to 3 brave astronauts and the thousands of men and women behind them during the final days of NASA's Apollo program.
Here man completed his first exploration of the moon. May the spirit of peace of all mankind.
In 1961, when President Kennedy launched the Apollo program, the space age was only in its 4th year. The commitment of sending a man across the hostile ocean of space to the moon was bold but necessary. America urgently needed a powerful demonstration of its technological superiority to convince the world that it could still contain the threat of Soviet aggression.
I think the Americans were very confident that they had a much superior system. They were looking towards the Soviet Union as a pretty backward society. And then all of a sudden, on the 12th of April 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to orbit the planet. That put the Americans, certainly at a cultural level, into a bit of a panic. It's fair to say that if the Americans had put the first human being into space, then we wouldn't have had the political drive for success that culminated in Project Apollo in the 1960s.
The National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, began assembling a task force of 400,000 top scientists and technicians that over the next 7 years would develop the vast spectrum of technologies needed to put a man on the moon.
I got involved in the Apollo principally because of my, I think, obsession with spaceflight. I started with reading Dan Daring Eagle, like a lot of people did, and then there was an advert in the Daily Telegraph which said they were looking for people to work on the Apollo program in the States. And I thought this was just the bee's knees. So I applied and got the job, and I thought I'd died and gone to heaven. Everybody who worked on Apollo was so enthusiastic. Of course, it was the race to space, and it was just magic.
Involvement in the Apollo program was really a fantastic thing. It seemed that almost anything was possible. I worked for Lockheed Electronics Company, and I supported the Guidance and Control Division laboratory. It was exciting at times, it was scary at times, but working on it gave a sense of achievement.
Kennedy's dream was finally realized in July 1969 when Apollo 11 touched down on the lunar surface, marking man's most significant accomplishment in the history of exploration. Photographs of flags and footprints were beamed around the world. America's prestige had been re-won, and they established themselves as the world's superpower. Politically, the race to beat the Russians to the moon had been won, but NASA's scientific mission was just beginning. Over the next 2 years, their confidence and proficiency in lunar exploration went from strength to strength. But in 1970, despite this monumental achievement, the 10 proposed missions were cut short, making Apollo 17 NASA's final lunar mission.
The public was losing interest because they just saw people going to the moon time and time again, apparently doing the same things, not realizing what science was being done. So with a lack of public interest, the government started to lose interest.
Scientifically, it's a tremendous loss, and had 18, 19 and 20 been allowed to continue, then there's no doubt that our knowledge of the moon and the history of the early solar system would be much bigger now than what it is had those missions continued. So scientifically, there was every reason to continue them.
If Apollo 17 was to be the last visit to the moon, NASA needed to make it count. NASA's growing confidence in supporting longer operations meant that Apollo 17 would become the most productive lunar mission of the entire program.
Apollo 17 was a mission of superlatives in so many ways, and it broke so many records. The crew spent 3 days on the lunar surface. Their moonwalks lasted 8 hours. They covered a greater distance than any other mission. And yet by December 1972, most of the American public and much of the global public had lost interest completely. So I always think of Apollo 17 as being the hidden jewel of the US lunar space program.
Apollo 17's mission commander was former U.S. Navy pilot and veteran astronaut Eugene Cernan. He is one of only 3 men who have voyaged to the moon twice. Cernan first flew on the Gemini program and later became the lunar module pilot on Apollo 10, the dress rehearsal for the lunar landing, where he flew within 15 kilometers of the surface. Cernan had to wait 3 years and 6 missions until he would fly again and finally set foot on the moon.
Gene Cernan was very good. He was very, very competent, and all these people were so keen to do a good job on the moon. It was really amazing. They really wanted to put our hardware out there and get it working and get the science.
Command Module pilot Ronald Evans was selected late into the Apollo program while flying combat missions in Vietnam. Apollo 17 would be his first and only spaceflight. Joe Engle was the proposed lunar module pilot, but after Apollo 18 was canceled and it became clear that this would be the final lunar mission, the scientific community pressed NASA to select a scientist astronaut to go to the moon. Engle was dropped from the program, and Harrison Schmitt, also known as Jack Schmitt, took his place to become the first and only geologist to step foot on the moon.
Jack Schmitt was picked as one of the first 6 original scientist astronauts in 1965. People said he had a fanatical focus upon Apollo. There were some of his colleagues who doubted that he had any other life apart from Apollo. But he got himself noticed for the right reasons, totally committed, changed geology training for the astronauts, raised the profile of geology within the entire program.
I met Harrison Schmitt on Apollo 15. He was the backup lunar module pilot. The experiments that I was working on had to be exercised by each crew member before we loaded them into the lunar module and sent them off to the moon. So Harrison Schmitt came over to have a look at the experiments and picked up the magnifying glass, and he looked at it and he said, "Do you know what a geologist does when he finds a rock to look at?" And we said, "No." And he said, "He does this." He said, "Have you ever tried doing that in a spacesuit?" But he was a great guy to work with, very easy and very professional, as most of them were.
On the 6th of December, 1972, the countdown to launch had begun. On the pad at the Kennedy Space Center stood the enormous Saturn V rocket.
It is still the largest vehicle ever to put human beings in space. It weighed about 6.8 million pounds. The thrust of the first stage was 7.5 million pounds. Just a really remarkable accomplishment. The one thing that I don't think anybody in this business ever feels is fear. Otherwise, you would not be out there walking to the rocket. You better have gotten used to that idea a long time ago. The thing that's different about launch day is that the launch pad is empty. There's nobody else there but you. Once that van drops you off at the spacecraft and you get in that elevator, you get in the elevator alone. Any other time you're out there looking at things, there are people all, like ants, they're everywhere, but not that night. And then we went across the catwalk to the command module hatch. It was a steel mesh floor. So walking over, you could look down and see the whole thing. Most everybody gets a little bit of a feeling in their stomach when they do that.
Roger. Blast booster. Go. S4B pre-press complete. Roger.
Flight booster. S1C pre-press complete. We're on internal power and we go.
At 12:33 on the morning of December 7th, 1972, they got the go for launch.
Astronauts reported feels good. T-minus 25 seconds.
Sequence initiated. Flight go.
Roger. Blast booster.
20 seconds and counting.
S4B pre-press complete. Roger.
Flight booster. Go.
15 seconds. Guidance is internal. 12, 11, 10, 9. Ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. Liftoff. Liftoff.
Apollo 17 is the only night launch of the Saturn V rocket. It turned night into day, and even from 500 miles away, it was incredibly bright in the night sky. And I think it was a fitting end to Project Apollo that night launch really summarized what the whole program was about.
17, your go.
17 is go.
You're looking great. Right on the line.
One of the things that you don't get in your training is the physical feeling of the launch.
I got a pitch and a roll program and this baby is really going.
Roger that. Stand by for mode 1 Bravo.
It's a very heavy, low-frequency vibration. The first thing that I remember thinking was, why did we do all the simulations? Because I couldn't read anything on the gauges. That vibration was something.
3 Gs, 3.5 Gs. Hold on.
Beautiful.
Fido.
Flight Fido, work go.
Go
All
across
hands
the
aboard.
Man.
I guess we got all 5.
They're looking here. Look good. We have you go for orbit here. Go for orbit.
Those are kind words, Robert. We're go for orbit here.
We had 2 orbits of the Earth before we were going to restart that third stage rocket that had inserted us into orbit in order to accelerate to 25,000 miles an hour and go to the moon.
At a distance of 45,000 kilometers, the crew took what is believed to be the most widely distributed photographic image of all time. Famously known as the Blue Marble, this incredible image was the first picture of the fully illuminated face of planet Earth.
We are seeing the Earth as it truly is, a grand oasis in the vastness of space.
We take our planet for granted, but seeing it like that, sort of isolated from everything, it just gave a different perspective. And I think in some ways it almost stimulated the environmental movement. We saw our planet as a whole, and we saw it as vulnerable.
The picture of the Earth as a blue marble brought home to people how fragile our Earth is, and how stupid all the arguments are between nations. We're just all on this big spaceship together, and we better get along.
No human being has since been at a distance where taking a whole Earth photograph like this has been possible. Exactly which of the Apollo crew took this amazing image is unclear, but like so many other aspects of the Apollo program, this breathtaking photograph changed our perception of our beautiful planet forever. Apollo 17's landing site was a small valley located in the Taurus-Latroux region. Taurus-Latroux sits close to the edge of an impact basin. This vast basin was formed about 3.9 billion years ago as a result of a comet or asteroid collision. The site's geological significance was of great interest to NASA.
Taurus-Latroux was chosen as a landing site for the last Apollo mission because it was a mixture of highland and lowland terrain. And of course they had a geologist as the principal investigator, if you like, on the mission itself. And I guess he was in his element driving around the moon's surface.
After 4 days and traveling 380,000 kilometers, the crew of Apollo 17 began orbiting the moon.
We, as human beings, committed ourselves to a gravitational field of another planet. And that was the first time. Apollo was the first time that human beings did that. There was no absolute guarantee that you were going to return. But it broke that bond with the Earth that ultimately, I'm sure, will lead humans on a path to the settlement away from our Earth.
Command Module pilot Ronald Evans stayed in lunar orbit conducting experiments, while Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt descended to the surface to complete their research.
Okay, 1511510 entered. 42 degrees, 47 now. 47 degrees through 49 degrees.
Okay, all flight controllers, go for landing. Retro, go. Fido, go. Guys, go. Control, go. Telcom, go. GNC, go. Ecom, go. Surgeon, go. Capcom, we're go for landing. Dellinger, you're go for landing.
I'll need the probe. I'll give it to you. Oh, are we coming in? Oh, baby. It's so hard to describe. It's incredible.
The lunar module pilot doesn't get to look outside very much. My job was to make sure that the commander had information off the computer that would tell him where he was going and gave him information as we got closer and closer to the surface on what his velocity rates were.
Okay, stand by for pitch over. We're level with the top of the Mesquite now.
Roger.
Stand by for pitch over, Jack. Pitch over. There it is. Proceeded. And there it is, Houston. There's Camelot. Wide on target. I see it. We got them all. 42 degrees, 37 degrees to 5,500. 38 degrees. 3,000 feet. 53 degrees. Okay, I've got Barre, I've got Poppy, I've got the triangle. Fuel is good. 1,500 feet. 54 degrees, Gene. Approaching 1,000. You're through 800 feet. H-dot's a little high. Yeah, I don't need the numbers anymore. Okay, you're 31 feet per second, going down to 500. That's a little high, Gino. Okay. Going down at 5. The fuel's good. 110 feet. Stand by for some dust. Little forward, G. Getting a little dust. You're at 60 feet. Going down about 2. Very little dust. Very little dust. 40 feet. Going down at 3. Stand by for touchdown. Stand by. 25 feet. Down at 2. Fuel's good. 20 feet. Going down at 2. 10 feet. Stand by. 10 feet. Contact. Stop push. Engine stop. Engine arm. Proceed. Command override off. Mode control add. Hold. Pings auto. Okay, Houston, the Challenger has landed. Houston, tell America the Challenger is at Source Littrow. Roger, Challenger, that's super.
On December 11th at 7:54 p.m., the lunar module Challenger touched down on the moon surface.
As I step off at the surface at Source Littrow, we'd like to dedicate the first steps of Apollo 17 to all those who made it possible. We thank you very much. This has got to be one of the most proud moments of my life, I guarantee you. Okay, Jack. How about the flag right over here in this little mound? Right there.
Watch your fingers. Don't know how far we could throw, but I think you hit something solid with that one. No, it was still going. Yeah, but did you ever see it vibrate like that? I've never put a flag up in the moon before. What? Pull that in. You're gonna have to get it down to my level. Tall guys are all alike. Okay? That's what looks like it's waving in the breeze. Yes, sir. How about right there? It does wave when you do that. We got a beautiful picture, you guys, up down there. Let me tell you, Bob, this flag is a beautiful picture.
My first concern stepping on the moon was to stay with the timeline. And as I came down the ladder, I was thinking of how we get maximum use of the time that was available. I had made a calculation at the time, I have no idea whether it was right or not, but that the time on the moon was worth about $1 million a man-minute. And that got my attention. And those were those year dollars, not this year dollars.
How's the TV working?
Beautiful.
Guess you believe we're here now, huh?
Now we believe you here. To coin a phrase, it's a panoramic scene of beauty.
Come on now, Bob. Hey, Bob, what do you think of the terrain?
Looks flat. Looks very flat and smooth.
That's why you're an astronomer.
Oh, well.
For the first half hour or so, I was in very familiar territory because I was primarily looking at the lunar module. I was working around it. We were unloading things that we would need, including the roving vehicle and things like that. When I first had a chance to move away from the spacecraft, my first duty was to go to the points of an equilateral triangle around the lunar module and take a set of pictures that would give as much of a pristine view of the landing site as we could. And that was the first time I had a chance to really see the lunar module in the context of this place where we had landed. Taurus Littrow was a deep mountain valley, deeper than the Grand Canyon, as a matter of fact. The mountains on either side rose to 6,000 and 7,000 feet above the valley floor. and were brilliantly illuminated by a sun as bright as one that you can imagine either in high snowfields or in the desert. But they were silhouetted against a black sky, an absolute black sky. And that's what you cannot get from the pictures that are printed, which doesn't give you the contrast that the eye sees when you're there.
Torres Littrow was the most dangerous landing site of the entire Apollo program. Although the risks taken to land in the Torres Littrow Valley were great, the payoff was the opportunity to sample a larger and more diverse selection of geological material than ever before.
Boy, is that pretty inside. Woo! We haven't seen anything like this. I haven't. Unless you've been holding out on me.
The samples returned would contain rock both older and younger than that of any other Apollo mission.
Torres Littrow Valley was selected because it was a diverse site geologically. Within an easy driving distance of the landing site, there are these highland blocks, the North Massif and the South Massif. These highland blocks were formed as mountains. Orbital imagery based on photographs taken by Apollo 15 had demonstrated the existence of boulders which had rolled down the mountains from high up on the slopes, where they'd carved tracks. And so accessing these boulders that had rolled down the massifs became a high priority. In addition to these boulders, a small fault runs across the valley called the Lee Lincoln Scarp, which it was considered would be of geological interest. And there was a landslide of clearly light-coloured highland material which had fallen off the South Massif mountain and covered the valley floor. So all in all, it was a very geologically diverse valley where a lot could be explored in the time available to the astronauts with their lunar roving vehicle.
Got a bag? Got a bag. The soil from right underneath the rock.
In addition to their geological studies, Cernan and Schmidt were to perform several experiments. The Apollo Lunar Surface Experiment Package, or ALSEP, contained 4 experiments never before deployed on the moon.
There was a brand new experiment to look at the lunar atmosphere. Now, the lunar atmosphere is a very good vacuum, but there are gases around. And it was a mass spectrometer that could actually detect different kinds of gases. There was a thing called a gravimeter, which was a very, very sensitive gravity measuring device, trying to measure the moon's gravitational pull, looking for very, very slow moonquakes to see if they existed. There was the Lunar Ejectron Meteoroid experiment, which was looking for small meteorites coming down and impacting it, dust-sized ones. And then finally, another seismic experiment with explosive charges, which were put out on the lunar surface as they drove around in the rover. And then they were fired later on from the Earth. Commands were sent when the crew had left. And they sent seismic shocks quite deeply down into the surface so that we could see what the strata was like underneath the surface of the moon.
The totality of scientific instruments and measurements deployed on the moon by Apollo 17, considering it was all done in 3 days and had to be combined with all this driving around and sampling, was really remarkable.
The lunar rover was an outstanding vehicle for field exploration. It weighed about 450 Earth pounds without anything on it. It got a little bit heavier as we got on it and put our equipment there. It could go about 6 or 7 miles per hour over that surface. Now that doesn't sound like very much, but I'll tell you, remember 1/6 gravity, you hit a bump and you're going to be off the surface a bit. And it does seem like it's going a lot faster than that. We actually had it up to 18 kilometers an hour, which would be about 12 or 13 miles an hour going downhill once. And I think even Gene Cernan regretted going quite that fast. It was pretty hard. The rover was a very, very productive vehicle and a tribute to the people who designed and built it.
The crew were on their first extravehicular activity, or EVA, when Cernan brushed against the rover. A hammer in the shin pocket of his spacesuit caught the buggy's rear fender and tore it in half.
Oh, you won't believe it. There goes a fender. Yeah, Bob, I got a little bit of a problem here. Oh, shoot.
Gene Cernan turned around and just scraped against the fender of the lunar roving vehicle, and it snapped a little bit of it off. Now, we might think that this was no big deal, but we need to remember, on the surface of the moon, this lunar dust used to get absolutely everywhere. With the lunar roving vehicle travelling at about 10 or 11 miles an hour at top speed, it was throwing lunar dust everywhere. Not only would the astronauts get covered with the material, but the material was very dark. Now remember, in an airless environment, if you're exposed to direct sunlight, you're going to heat up massively. It's one of the reasons that the outer layer of the Apollo astronaut suits were white. And so what seems to us on Earth to be a relatively minor issue was going to seriously compromise the potential science that could have been obtained from the rest of the mission.
Well, everything's getting awful dusty. Everything is just full of dust.
With the dust threatening the astronaut's safety, something had to be done. In spite of his thick gloves, Gene Cernan managed to unroll and tear off strips of duct tape in an attempt to repair the damaged fender.
And Dina, how you doing on that fender? Bob, I am done. If that fender stays on, I'm going to take a picture of it, because I'd like some sort of mending award. Let's hope. Keep your fingers crossed, and I'll be more careful around the fenders. Okay, copy that.
His quick-fix solution held out. For the next 4 hours, they continued to drive the rover without any problem, stopping to drill holes, collect core samples, and deploy seismic charges. But while on a rough patch of lunar terrain, the fender broke again, and a new problem arose. A thick coating of dark lunar dust began covering the rover's batteries, which were now absorbing the heat from the sun and at risk of overheating.
We got pretty dirty. We cleaned our pressure suits between every EVA, but you could see the scratches on the wrists and on the helmet. Good engineering is going to have to keep the dust out of things. It is very abrasive, but you could still see the scratches. Yours truly, it doesn't prove I was on the moon, but I seem to have had an awful good time while I was there, and not at all bashful about standing around in my underwear.
Back at Houston, NASA engineers understood the seriousness of the situation. If they couldn't come up with a solution while Cernan and Schmidt slept, the next day's exploration would be severely inhibited, limiting the astronauts to within walking distance of the lunar module. Apollo 16 Commander John Young was on the case.
John Young spent the night working in a spacesuit back at Houston, working out a procedure to fix it. And they worked out that they would use an old map that they'd already been using that they didn't need again. They taped it into a curve and then found 2 little clamps which they could use to clamp it to the dust guard.
When the astronauts woke the next morning, Mission Control had instructions for a replacement fender. The new fender held for the rest of the mission, which was to be another 15 hours of EVAs.
Apollo 17's true science potential was saved by duct tape. Don't go anywhere without it.
Although the lunar rover allowed the astronauts to cover great distances, they still had to travel on foot when setting up experiments and collecting samples. They quickly became confident moving in the lower gravity of the moon, which is 1/6 of that on Earth.
Oh, bury me not on a lone prairie where the coyotes hum in the windblown tree. This is the best way for me to travel, uphill or downhill. What's that? Like this, 2-legged hop, and on level ground I can skip. This 2-legged thing is great. Man, I can cover ground like a kangaroo. Whee! I was strolling on the moon one day in a merry, merry month of December. Now, May's the month. May, that's right. May is the year of the month.
They did, however, end up with their knees in the dust on more than one occasion.
Okay, yep. Remind me to dust my camera too, will you? Don't forget to dust your camera. I'm gonna get this thing out now that I got it. No. Boys, you know, that's what you call getting down into your work. No, dadgummit. Would you come over and help twinkle toes, please?
Anytime you felt a little bit homesick, you could look up and see the Earth, only 240,000 miles away. I must say, though, that the communications were outstanding. I never felt isolated on the moon at all.
During their second EVA, the crew visited a crater named Shorty Crater. Shorty had excited scientists back on Earth, as it's surrounded by a halo of soil that is significantly darker than the general terrain. After the 7-kilometer drive to Shorty Crater, Harrison Smith looked to the soil stirred up by his feet. He found what is considered to be one of the most significant of all Apollo's discoveries.
Oh, hey! There is orange soil. Well, don't move it till I see it. It's all over. Orange. Don't move it till I see it. I've stirred it up with my feet. Hey, it is! I can see it from here. It's orange.
You know, there's a stereotype about science as being dull and unemotional. I think the story of the orange soil on Apollo 17 just blows that myth to pieces, because when you look at the pictures of the moon, they could be colour pictures, but the moon looks pretty grey. And then all of a sudden, on Apollo 17, in this monochrome landscape, you've got bright orange soil appearing. Now, when this was reported, you can hear it in the voices back in mission control. You know, there is orange soil, there's excitement. And I'll never forget that there's one of the geologists supporting the mission, and he is almost shaking with excitement.
Fantastic, sports fans. I've got my tools of the trade right here.
The significance of this was that the orange soil, it was thought, could be evidence of volcanic activity. Now, this landing site had been chosen specifically to try and look for evidence of volcanic activity. So it's, I think the words that Jack Schmitt used were, I think we found what we were looking for.
Oh man, that's incredible. Jack, that is really orange.
When analysed through a microscope, the coloured soil turns out to be made of tiny, tens of micron-sized orange glass beads that's been erupted in a fire fountaining eruption in the Taurus Littrow Valley. The orange glasses are in fact the youngest samples found in the Taurus Littrow Valley, but they're still 3.6 thousand million years old. Because the moon seems to be so dry, it had been assumed that the primary volatile responsible for driving these fire fountainings was carbon dioxide gas. But evidence has been found that some of the volatiles responsible for driving this volcanism may have been water after all. And so these glasses are still, 40 years on, actively at the centre of lunar science today.
And as I step out onto the plains of Taurus Littrow, oh, what a nice day. Oh, funny, there's not a cloud in the sky, except in the Earth.
The astronauts' third and final EVA provided an opportunity to study the large boulders that had rolled down the north wall of the Taurus Littrow Valley.
This large boulder had rolled down the North Massif about 1.5 kilometers. I'm there for scale. It hit a change in slope and broke into 5 pieces there and stopped. And it has told us a great deal about the nature of these huge impacts that have occurred on the moon and before that occurred on the Earth.
Holy smoly! Why are we on a slope? You okay?
It's one of the blue-gray rocks, Bob, and it's got a light-colored fragment that runs the full height of it, about 1.5 meters thick, and then it's got the blue-gray rock on the other side. Okay. Here I am, folks, in the middle of a boulder field. Just minding my own business.
In lunar orbit, Ron Evans conducted extensive experiments from the command module America, charting the lunar surface using a panoramic camera and laser altimeter. Used in conjunction with other scientific instrumentation, Evans collected more information for accurately mapping the surface of the moon. The invaluable images and data collected by Apollo are still widely used by research scientists and astronomers today.
Ron Evans seemed to have a lot of fun while he was alone up there. One of the problems with the source of our water was that a little bit of hydrogen would leak into the water. And here Ron has worked that hydrogen into a bubble so that he could take it back and demonstrate they had missed getting that hydrogen out. The reason it was important to us is that, what goes in must come out, and much to the discomfort of your crewmates.
Before leaving for the moon, Cernan made a very special promise to his daughter. He told her that he would write her initials in the lunar dust, making her the only little girl on Earth to have her name on the moon. Just before Apollo 17 left the moon, Cernan took a moment to kneel and with a single finger wrote his daughter Tracy's initials, TDC, in the lunar dust, knowing those 3 letters would remain there undisturbed for millions of years.
It's a rock composed of many fragments of many sizes and many shapes. When we return this rock, or some of the others like it, to Houston, we'd like to share a piece of this rock with so many of the countries throughout the world. We hope that this will be a symbol of what our feelings are, what the feelings of the Apollo program are, and a symbol of mankind that we can live in peace and harmony in the future.
Apollo 17 was a record-breaking mission. During their 3 days on the moon, Eugene Cernan and Harrison Schmitt completed 22 hours of lunar exploration and research, more than any other Apollo mission that had gone before. They had driven a total of 34 kilometers through the Taurus-Latrobe Valley and positioned the most comprehensive set of instruments ever deployed on the lunar surface. They had collected and documented over 110 kilograms of moon rock and soil and taken over 2,400 photographs. But now, it was time to go home. In their final moments on the moon, Harrison Schmitt made a rather unusual request.
There's an interesting scene from the last moments of the final EVA on the surface of the moon in Apollo 17, and it was Jack Schmitt and his hammer throwing. Now, I'm not sure if this is a geologist tradition or it was just a Jack Schmitt tradition, but when you look at the footage, you can see that Gene Cernan's getting ready to throw it, and Jack really wants to throw it, and Gene Cernan, almost as a recognition of the great work that he's done, says, "Okay, Jack, you go ahead and do it," and you see him throwing it away.
Let me throw the hammer, please. It's all yours. A hammer thrower, you're a geologist, you ought to be able to throw it. You ready? Go ahead. You ready for this? Yeah. Don't hit the lamp. Look at that. Look at that. Look at that. Beautiful. Looked like it was going 1,000,000 miles, didn't it?
I think that it may well have been an old geologist tradition. I know that a definite geologist tradition is a tradition of rolling pebbles or rolling boulders.
Go, roll! Look, I would roll on this slope, why don't you? The old boulder rolling trick. Don't hit the rover.
Jack Schmitt indulged that, and he also got Gene Cernan to do that as well, and they did do their rock rolling on the surface of the moon during Apollo 17.
The pressure of producing the speech to draw to an end the first set of manned explorations on the moon fell on mission commander Eugene Cernan. He had prayed that when the time came, he would find words of power and purpose. As he surveyed the lunar landscape for the very last time, he simply spoke from the heart and closed a chapter of human courage, ingenuity, and discovery.
We'd like to uncover a plaque that has been on the leg of our spacecraft that we have climbed down many times over the last 3 days. So that when this plaque is seen again by others who come, they will know where it all started. Here man completed his first exploration of the moon, December 1972 AD. May the spirit of peace in which we came be reflected in the lives of all mankind. This is our commemoration that will be here until someone like us So some of you out there who are the promise of the future, come back to read it again. And to further the exploration and the meaning of Apollo.
Back on Earth at Mission Control, Ed Fendell, who had been responsible for remotely operating the lunar cameras during Apollo 17, was poised to capture the one shot that had eluded NASA over the previous 5 missions. A clean view of the lunar module takeoff. This would be the last chance to get this elusive shot. With a 6-second signal delay, Fendell had to correctly time the movement of the camera with the flight path of the lunar module in advance. The results were truly spectacular.
99, proceeded, 3, 2, 1, ignition. We're on our way, Houston. Vector good. Mag spot. Take your final look at the valley and towards Central. Good to see you. Good to have you all back up here. It's been a good trip. Man, that Challenger is a beautiful vehicle. You betcha.
Following the rendezvous and docking with Ron Evans in the command module, the crew proceeded to transfer the precious lunar samples and film. Apollo 17 spent an additional 3 days in lunar orbit, conducting yet more orbital science, and they would be the last men to witness the famous Earthrise.
And as we leave the moon and towards Literal, we leave as we came, and God willing, as we shall return, with peace and hope for all mankind. Godspeed the crew of Apollo 17.
On the return journey, Ron Evans had the chance to complete an EVA of his own. Leaving the safety of the command module, he ventured on a spacewalk to retrieve vital film from the onboard external cameras.
Going up? Am I clear? You're clear, Manco. Am I on the tube?
That's affirmative. Outstanding quality picture, Ron.
Okay.
3 days later, we've entered the Earth's atmosphere. Our actual entry peaked G's at 7 times gravity, just for an instant, because we wanted to be sure, of course, we were captured in the atmosphere. The command module actually was flown by the computer. At 35,000 miles an hour, almost anything is going to have lift of some kind if you orient it right, and the command module did. At this point, we had gone through the deployment of drogue chutes at 25,000 feet, and then this deployment of the main chutes at about 10,000 feet. And we were moving down towards the water, I believe at about 16 feet per second.
Apollo 17 may have been viewed by many cynics as a lackluster mission. But nothing could be further from the truth. When the crew finally splashed down in the warm blue waters of the Pacific Ocean, it didn't just signify the closing of the Apollo program, but the true end of an era.
Apollo has transformed the way we look at the moon. Apollo has transformed our understanding of the moon's importance. There is a treasure trove of discoveries still to be made from the lunar samples, from the instruments that are still active on the surface of the moon. Yes, it was an incredibly expensive program, but when you've got something which 40 years later is still enabling new scientists to develop new ideas and new theories, then that tells you something about the program's value.
It was an extraordinary period in human history. We gained a first-order understanding of another planet for the first time. And what was accomplished by the generation of Apollo does symbolize a great new understanding of what we now know about the early history of the Earth. It symbolizes a new source of resources for the planet, particularly in energy, and it symbolizes a new path to the settlement of our solar system.
Before we went to the moon, all we knew about it was what we could get from telescopes. Getting to the moon, being able to bring samples back, to be able to make measurements of its atmosphere, its magnetic field, what its structure was, taught us a lot, not only about the moon, but how the Earth and the moon were created originally.
Apollo 17 was the culmination of the whole Apollo program, and it put a very satisfactory line under the whole thing, and scientists are still studying the data brought back by the whole program.
Certainly Apollo 17 was the most productive scientifically in terms of samples returned and scientific instruments deployed.
I think Apollo 17 did mark the end of an era. Since then, we haven't travelled into space as far. That impetus to get out there, to almost travel to the stars, has waned.
It told man that more or less anything was possible.
It brought everybody together. I think for the first time, people all over the world were interested in one thing and what was going on at that one time.
The Apollo missions have ended, but we need something to take its place and something to inspire people and something to get us, as the human race, out there and beyond.
Many believe that a return to the moon holds the key to man's future in space.
We will be going back to the moon. The best move, if we're going to Mars, is to go back to the moon. Because if we can't keep people supported on the moon and keep them in good condition, it's no good going to Mars, because we won't be able to do it when they're a heck of a lot further away.
We can do it. We could go to the moon in the 1960s and 1970s. We could go to the moon now if we had the political willpower and if we decided to put the financing in. None of the astronauts involved would have expected us to be here 4 decades later and still not having seen a return to the moon. But ultimately, the Apollo for our times would be the challenge of getting a human being to Mars. It's not just about exploration, it's about securing the future for humanity. That's what human beings have done throughout history. We have been a species that wants to explore, to push forward our frontiers. The Earth is our cradle, but we can't stay in the cradle forever.
Whatever the future holds, one thing is for sure. Apollo's overwhelming contribution to science has given us a new perspective on the moon, our own unique planet, and the universe beyond.
I was sad that the programme came to an end. Obviously we'd like it to have gone on much longer. But even though Apollo ended and we were sad, we continued with some really exciting work.
It was a fantastic experience. I definitely feel proud that I was part of the Apollo program, even a very minor cog in a big machine. If I had my time again, I most certainly would move heaven and earth to work on something like that again. It was really fun.
Apollo 17 was a fitting conclusion to a triumphant space program which will inspire future generations for many years to come. What NASA achieved in the decade following Kennedy's pledge is a testament to man's ingenuity.
We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon. We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things. Not because they are easy, but because they are hard. Many years ago, great British explorer George Mallory, who was to die on Mount Everest, was asked why did he want to climb it. He said because it is there. Well, space is there, and we're going to climb it. And the moon and the planets are there. And new hopes for knowledge and peace are there. And therefore, as we set sail, we ask God's blessing on the most hazardous and dangerous and greatest adventure on which man has ever embarked.